welcome to another podcast episode hosted by the Penang Institute. My name is Fauwaz Abdul Aziz. I'm an analyst with the Penang Institute's History and Regional Studies program. We have with us today again the Executive Director of Penang Institute, Dato Dr. Ooi Kee Beng. Welcome back to the podcast, Dr. Ooi. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Fauwaz.
I think your piece for the South China Morning Post is a good piece with which to kick off our discussion because it gives much needed context to what Professor Wu Wing Tai calls Trump's tariff tantrums. So using your South China Morning Post piece as reference, could you perhaps give us that context in terms of decolonization in the global South and China in particular, as well as the policies of import substitution, industrialization, and export-oriented development? I see these as good context for the tariffs.
If we go back to after the Second World War, right, when you started seeing post-colonial countries come into being, Indonesia came immediately into being after the Second World War. And so Malaysia 57, Singapore 65, and so on and so forth, right? And so when Malaysia started, for example, you think economics first of all, and we were importing most modern goods, right? So common conclusion: let's produce this ourselves. That way we will save foreign exchange, on foreign exchange, so on. So import substitution, I think they called it. Very quickly, it showed that it didn't work across the world. I think you waste a lot of resources because your people don't know what they're doing. You don't have the infrastructure. You don't have the right machines. You don't have the right work ethos, even, right? And so very quickly they noticed this is not going to work. But then the new theories were already coming that is not the way to go. Good global economies were coming up with a solution, which was that it should be export orientation. You should be producing things to export to the market. You go for the demand instead of trying to save your foreign exchange balance, as it were. And so most countries started going into that. Now, if we take the case of Penang Institute in 1969, 1970, when Penang's economy was in a very, very bad way because the free port status had been taken away. And that was the time when electronics were coming. So Singapore, I think, had started. Taiwan was about to start. So Penang, under the PDC and under Chief Minister Dr. Lim Chong Yew, got into the act. He got a good team together, led by Chet Singh, the first general manager of PDC, and they started what amounts to actually export orientation. Export orientation in this case, you need FDIs, you need foreign help. FDI comes in, companies come in, MNCs come in. So what you attract them with is land, some infrastructure, pioneer status where you don't have to pay taxes for 10 years, 20 years, whatever, and cheap labor, but cheap trainable labor, not any cheap labor, right? And so Malaysia had that advantage. Penang had that last advantage. We had trainable people, and so it took off. So Penang today is the 5th largest producer of electronic chips in the world, which is quite something, right? So that is one case of how export orientation actually did work. You see all these little smaller countries that were just starting out, trying to create a manufacturing base. They would be producing for the markets, which would be largely Western, right? Now, when this happens and all these countries are not grouped as if it were the Soviet Union or something, then you can handle that. They're just people producing for you on the manufacturing market. And then China gets into the act, right? In the beginning, we have to realize 1949, when China became, I won't say independent, that's when they finally settled all their internal conflicts, and they had managed to kick out all foreigners, including the Japanese. Then they decided they were not going to deal with the world. They wanted to create a world of their own, taking inspiration from Marxistic thinking and so on. And along with the Soviet Union. So you had the Cold War, where they were separated. China realized after 20, 30 years, this is not going to work. In a way, they isolated themselves. Right? Enter Deng Xiaoping, did a world tour, among other places, to Singapore, I understand. And I think he saw the wisdom of the export orientation system. We don't call it that. In the Chinese case, for some reason, we don't call it that. We call it reform and opening up. What I'm saying in the article is, let's just call it export orientation. In a way, imported the world into China. And they did it in stages because they didn't want the whole system to be quickly changed, right? That would be too much to handle socially and politically. And so China did that. 2001, they managed to get into the WTO, meaning now they're a full-fledged player in this system where the third world, the global south, if I use that term, the global south was producing for the Western market. When there were many small countries, the West could deal with them. When it was China, they loved it because it was so much cheaper and so on and so forth. And the capitalists moved in big time into China. Workshop of the world, and all at all levels, all the way up to high tech practically. And so China could offer that, right? That none of the other third global south countries could. But at some point, it becomes a problem for the market, the importing market, and over the years you see how the debt level of the US has become. It's what, I don't know what the figure is, 3 trillion US or something. Something crazy. You'll never be able to pay that back, meaning that your great-great-grandchildren are in debt to the world. And I think that's where the US actually is at.
They didn't expect China to be such a phenomenal success.
The great irony now here is that this strongest country in the world since 1945 and before is now adopting something that we recognize, which is import substitution. That's what tariffs are. So I would call tariffs import substitution tools. And now the hope is that now guys come back to bring your factories in, We'll stop the imports. And then you come in, and so we can create stuff so that we can export.
Make America great again with.
I don't know I don't know what that means, but I think they're looking to. That's another story. I think maybe you could talk about that later. But so I think that those are two things going on. One is this, that the US, the global market has decided that it cannot continue to be the market and not the producer. So it needs to do import substitution. Now, in this of course, it's a simplification of the whole situation. You notice that the tariffs that Trump puts into place does not involve services largely, and that's where the Americans are strong. Now, the second thing that we see in what Trump is doing, and that goes to your "Make America Great Again." And it goes back to also history and how we see it again in Malaysia and in most global South countries as well. When you become independent, you look back at history and you want to pinpoint a time when things went wrong and when things were wonderful and so on. So make America great again. Of course, next question: when exactly? Right?
And what made it great?
and you pick and choose. I think before that, I don't think you had anything like that.
British Empire.
And so America got drawn into that. So it becomes the global hegemon. It becomes the policeman of the world. It becomes in the end, their dollar becomes what people use, and so on and so forth. All that fine and good until a point when you get an internal reaction to it, a domestic reaction to it. That came, I suppose, after the 2008 destruction of the middle class in America, when suddenly Americans themselves are wondering what the hell is happening here. Let's their isolationist tendencies became stronger, and what we see as nationalism, American style, right? So you're having nationalism in a hegemon. in a global hegemon here. So I think that suddenly there's a conflict between two streams in American development. One is that they took over as the hegemon of the world, following the Europeans, and the other was that they were wanting to be another type of Europe, right? An Enlightenment-based Europe and so on. They were going to build a country that was America, not global hegemon, right? And that sort of explains, I think, why the first thing Trump wanted was to. He talked about Panama, Mexico, Canada, Greenland, all the places around, and then renaming the Bay of Mexico and so on, right? All this to me are obviously, well, this is nation building, but since it's America, it's continent building. Something that never got completed in the minds of certain American mentalities, perhaps, you know. But we shouldn't go too far into to this, other than my pointing out that there is a continent building going on here. What is in the end? You're wondering, why is Denmark there anyway? But history is not that neat, right? And why is Canada not America, right? Could have been some other twist in history, and it never was its own country. So it's that kind of flux and self-serving ideological and historical thinking that penetrates the world of Trump, I think.
Yeah, I like what I mean. It's more of an aside, but something you said about how the public statements and the pronouncements that people like Trump have issued, they're not so much to inform you or to increase understanding, but rather to confuse and to mislead. Now, you talked about how certain phrases and terms and vocabulary are used in order to have that effect. So, but what's interesting to me is many times when what's more important than what's being said is what's not said. And so when you talk about, so when people say, for example, free and open Indo-Pacific, as you pointed out, they're actually implying dominance by entities such as China that are not free or open. That's the more important point, what is not being said. Or when they talk about alliance of democracies, they're actually talking about all those others that are authoritarian. So I think it's a very important point, because some people don't realize that they're caught in a discourse. They don't even realize it's a discourse, but they take it as fact, and they start going, yes, actually, yeah. Why are we, you know? But I just remembered that as an aside to your article. So back to what you were saying. So in effect, China became phenomenally more successful than the former colonial states could imagine it to have been, and they were caught up. I mean, they, in a way, they had created a monster. I mean, it was a monster of their own making, a monster that had succeeded, but succeeded beyond their expectations. Now, how did the U.S. fare? I think you wrote about this in the SEMP. How did the U.S. fare during these eras of import substitution and export-oriented industrialization? I mean,
their hegemonic power over the last 50, 70 years have depended on that it served them. Well, it's a study in power exercised at the global level, right? So I suppose one could write a good book starting 1945 with the fall of Hitler on how the forming of a new world order could be seen as rather technical, neutral and technical, or you could be more Foucaultian and look at it less generously, and consider how structures and ideas were put into place that would create and consolidate a certain power structure. And even if others have some benefits out of it, they can never challenge the real power itself. And that's the whole point of the United Nations, that we shall all be equal, right? But very quickly you had a United Nations General Assembly, which a lot of apologists started using the term rules-based order, use-based order. Now, anyone who's a political scientist will immediately say, whose rules? To imagine that when you say rules-based order, the alternative is disorder, that's nonsense.
Yeah.
But somehow, even educated people, over the last 10, 20 years, seem to think, oh, we want a rules-based order, something China doesn't want.
Yeah.
There's no such thing. You know what I mean? Again, back to what you were saying, that somehow we're very willing to be fooled by some neat phrase.
The way I kind of saw it, I mean, from my eyes, is that he asks the right questions. Why are you without jobs? Why are you in this industry? Why are you in this state? But he's pointing to the wrong answers. He's saying, like, for example, the immigrants are the reason for your despair. The foreigners are the reason for your situation.
If we just keep to the pure formalities of economics and so on, some of the solutions will be quite obvious. But if you want to make things confused by throwing all sorts of funny econometric stuff in there, like that a trade imbalance is someone cheating, how does that even work? I mean, I go to my local coffee shop. They never buy anything from me. I buy from them. What does the imbalance look like? It's not an imbalance I suffer from. It's an imbalance. They've never bought anything from me. I buy everything from them, and I'm very happy. So what is this? Where is this coming from? So we have the case of Lesotho being hit with 50% or something. Lesotho sells diamonds to America and doesn't buy any iPhone, and therefore the balance is off. Is anyone hurt by this? You don't have to buy the diamonds. And the paradox is that we've come to a point where one could say that America is trying what third world countries tried to do from day one, which is import substitution.
So in the piece for The Edge, you start by pointing out the irony of President Trump's Liberation Day. Here's a world hegemon, a nation that possesses, as you point out, military, economic, and political power of global proportions. Yet Trump claims the U.S. is a victim of other countries and other economies. And Trump looks back nostalgically at an ideal past.
Now, what I find interesting, and your point, trying to connect it to Malaysia and other countries, is that I find in certain countries, especially Malaysia, in certain areas in Malaysian political discussion, of being anti-colonial, and anti-colonial means let's play down the cultural importance of everything that happened under the British. And I think, of course, the more indigenous peoples would maybe fall for that line. Those who are less indigenous, who came here with the British, after the British came, they can't imagine a time before that, right? So as a power play, you can see why indigenism will do that thing. So nationalism, especially ultra-right, will do this. They will cut away recent history and play up ancient history. Same thing, let's say in Scandinavia, the ultra-right will talk about the might of the Vikings and not Swedish industry, or So there is, to me, that I mean there are other ways, I'm sure, of using history, but to me this is a good polar situation. Do you look at the history of recent times, or you do go back to a time that was totally past so that you can do whatever you wanted with it, right? Yeah. But the trouble is that the recent history is what gives you knowledge about your present situation. And so a lot of the nonsense coming out of Trump is a denial of the present situation. You know, why is China so strong vis-a-vis why did so much industry move over to China and so on? Because that is the nature of capitalism, profit maximization. So companies, to compete with each other, will go to places where they can make the largest profit. They're not paying politics at all. So they just go in, and the Chinese government opened their population to this. And of course, as China grew, who were making the money? The Western capitalists, right? But easily, let's forget about that, right? You know, that kind of thing. But let's say in the Malaysian context, it also means that we have this discourse about pendatang, people who came later, immigrants and so on. Immigrants who have been here for generations, they're still called immigrants because you want to use this lens that I was talking about of denying the last 200 years. I've been recently looking at the book called Globalization, The History of Peras Economy, I think, written by Sultan Nasrin Shah, no one less. And I took that, I was quite fascinated by that subject, in that here was someone writing about history at a more localized level, instead of Malaysian history and then Perak being a chapter in it. Because if you go to more localized history, the people start appearing. If you're too national in your description of history, you're probably lying a lot, because nations are constructions, as it were. But if you go to the lower level, then the people appear, the sweat, blood and tears start appearing, right? And it's a smaller geographical unit, and you tend to say more concrete things about it. And that's why I mentioned his book in there as well.
Yeah. So again, to go back to the issue of framing is very important. I mean, perhaps at the national level, things are a bit more abstract. Maybe it's at the local level that you as you wrote in your article, that's where relationships are formed. Where, as you say, people are more real.
I see a connection here in how one sees words. What is the status of words? What is the status of a noun? What is the status of a verb, right? So what I mean by that is that when you say events, you're thinking of a description, right? It's been a snapshot's been taken, right? And so you could call that the Second World War or the First World War. And then, as we know, were there two world wars, or was there only one, right? That kind of thing, right? So a noun sort of transfixes something, just like your name Fauwaz transfixes you, right? I'm Kee Beng, right? And then suddenly there are certain things Kee Beng doesn't do. You know, there are certain processes in me that wants to go out, but Kee Beng doesn't do that kind of thing. Yeah. So if then why philosophy, language philosophy? You take noun and verb then, right? Verbs are in flow. Nouns are snapshots. So verbs are videos, and nouns are pictures. If I use that, right? And what you're saying is that the flow of time and events and so on contains much more information than what the pictures can do, right? But then, as you know, you can't film everything, so it's still unclear what is true, what is false, right? You can choose to film certain things, and you can tell another story, but that is the nature of history. And one should take the lesson one should take from it is that all social knowledge is tentative. You can't claim true or false. It's more poetic in that, does it give you something to think like that? Is there a therapeutic value in thinking like that? You know how certain poems will just enrapture you, and there's nothing for someone else. Now, some might think that's quite a stretch. You can go across to history, which are claims of truth in a way, right? And yet, the truth here is a very small t, as it were, right? Just like poems. And so it's how we relate to what we want to be knowledge, really, right? if knowledge is in flux because it's always stated by words, words are not, doesn't matter how articulate you are, words are not the truth. They're a proxy for it.
I was just thinking, like, I mean, I usually think of how important process and fluidity and flow is important to keep conversations and dialogue going. But then, like you said, you can't avoid sometimes this sense of thinking of who you are. Who are you? Meaning your values. What are your values? And that's where we need to couple process with talking about values. So what are our values? What are your values? And what are the values that conflict? How can we? But the important thing is, it goes back to process. The important thing is always to keep the dialogue going, dialogue flowing, rather than stopping and saying, well, that's your history, this is my history, and then
I like to differentiate between my values and my ethos. In that, I think value, when I say value, I'm coming closer to formulating for your sake, for the external world. This is my value. My ethos is how I am habitually moving. You know what I mean? I live by it. I don't care if you know or not. This is how I move. So it's not for common consumption. It's how I live with myself. That would be my ethos, my work ethos, my whatever. This is how I keep my integrity together, my integratedness together, right? Values tend to immediately become sanctions or commands, and then immediately hypocrisy comes in, and it becomes debate, discourse, whatever, right? I mean, all that are necessary, but what I mean is, one shouldn't put one's soul or one's psyche too far in front. There is quite a long space between my innermost me and when I express my values, you know. You know what I mean? One should be that generous to oneself. My soul is bigger than the social, immediate social.
Instead of values, maybe what I mean is meaning. What is meaning? What has meaning to me? So it's not just process and flow, but what has meaning to you. And because meaning is what you act out.
Yeah, exactly that. A value is what you have before you act. Meaning is something that cannot appear except through some action, some stance you take. Right? So that's a very important point. Now, as you would know, I'm a Wittgenstein nut, right? And so the notion of meaning is a concept I am very concerned about and interested in. We always say, when we say mean, we want something to come after it, a predicate. I mean that something. But I'm more interested in the ability to mean. What is this ability to mean? When you talk to someone, they can be fluent, they can talk all sorts of things, but you don't quite trust them, you don't think he's an interesting person. Somehow you feel he can't mean all this, what he's saying and so on. So how do you know what a person means except through his actions, right? So it's what he invests in. If he's someone full of opinions, but all he does is sit at home and watching TV, so his ability to mean cannot be in the words. His ability to mean must be in his actions. So our religious duty, if I call it that, spiritual duty, is to mean. That is what you do. So don't go around asking, what is the meaning of life? Who is the meaning giver? Who is the meaning maker? It's you.
You make meaning.
But to assume meaning comes from outside, then you're in trouble.
Yeah.
Now the Chinese use the word qi, vital energy, as like to explain everybody, right? And I like to think using that concept when I wake up in the morning, especially at my age. You don't wake up the same way every day. You wake up, the way you're feeling, the energy you're feeling, that's you. And with that energy, you are able to mean something You can use that energy and mean something. You might write the best speech in the world, or you'll just watch TV and waste all that energy. That's it. That's you. You are the meaning giver. And I mean, my family means a lot to me and so on. But I know that if I drop dead tomorrow, they will adapt, and then after 2 years, I will mean nothing. I will be a memory. You know what I mean? The meaning is the chi. The meaning is the power. How you exercise the power, flow, if you like. That's why the Chinese Taoism is flow and Tao and all that. That is it. That's it. Beyond that, there is nothing. The agent is you. Don't give agency to external things that might not be voluntary in any way. The voluntary agent is you. And that you are responsible for all meaning in the world, in your life. You know what I mean? I would lean that way. It sounds a bit radical, but I am responsible for meaning in this world. Whatever I don't give meaning to has no meaning.
With that, we conclude this podcast episode. Dr. Ooi Kee Beng shared his view as a historian on US President Donald Trump's tariffs, and pointed out some ironies and paradoxes of the US's recent policies and what they might imply or reflect of the deeper anxieties held by American leaders and policymakers. In addition to touching on the importance of thinking with history rather than the selective use of history for parochial purposes, Dr. Ooi suggests what Malaysians might learn about ourselves. Thank you for listening. This is Fauwaz Abdul Aziz signing off from The Road Ahead, a podcast by the Penang Institute.